Well, here we are at lesson 9. Jim Parsons, your online writing mentor, bringing you a course you would probably pay hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars for somewhere else. It's absolutely free, so tell all your friends. Here's something for you. Tell just 3 of your friends, and I will give you a bonus. The bonus is a wonderful sense of peace and goodwill at having done the right thing by your friend. Could I be fairer than that? All right, we're at a crossroads with this course. Up till now, I've been leading you through all the planning stages. But last week, if you're following the course and doing the exercises as I've suggested them, you should now have written your first chapter, maybe even a couple of chapters. So we're at a point where you need every skill right now, all the writing skills, boom, 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 boom. I can't deliver that, so I have to make some choices. Now, I did tell you that one writing technique, one method for novice writers is to get some ideas and then do some writing, write a chapter or 2, and then stop, pause, take stock of what you have. Check the character. Is it the character as well drawn as you would like? Is their goal strong enough? And the other thing to look at is the narrative voice you've used. Is it the right one? Now, if you've written a chapter, you have used a narrative voice. Surprise! But is it the right one? It very likely is. Somehow or other, stories have a way of suggesting the right narrative voice. But it doesn't hurt to check and to experiment with others. At the very worst, you waste a day, but you prove that the one you've got is the best, the one you like best of all. So here is a list of the narrative voices that I'm going to look at in this lesson, explain them to you, tell you what's right, what's useful about them, what's a hindrance about them, because each one has its own positives and negatives. Here's the list of what we're doing today. Very well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the types of narrative voice. I'll take you through the invisible narrator, the voiced narrator, the minor character narrator, the first person narrator, that's your protagonist or main character, and third person, which again, usually your main character. And third person can be omniscient or limited or with multiple voices. I'll look at the pros and cons of each of these, and I'll finish up with some general recommendations. That's what you've got to look forward to in lesson 9. First, let's look at just what is this narrating voice. I'm sure I don't need to convince you that the plot that you've dreamt up is a construct, something you've built. That the characters that you're using are a construct, something you've dreamt up and you're creating. But you may not be quite as aware that the narrator, the person telling the story or the entity telling the story, is as much a construct, as much a part of your writing as the plot and the characters. And this is true even of the type of narration that I call the invisible narrator. It's just a term I've dreamt up. You probably won't find it in any writing books, but then again you might, because there's nothing new under the sun. So here is an example of what I refer to as the invisible narrator. It's when you're trying to not be there at all, keep people concentrating on story itself. Okay, let's look at this thing called an invisible narrator. Here's something to illustrate it. On a warm October night, 2 men stood in the deep shadows of a clump of palms near the Crowne Plaza Hotel at Northcliffe, across from the light rail stop in the centre of the roadway. It was 12:30 a.m. The shorter man, Mike Bowman, had his face turned towards the tree trunks. His companion, Alex Smart, tall and thick-set, studied the approaching tram. "Come on, don't be a wuss. All you have to do is point him out. I'll do the rest." He nudged him in the ribs with the pistol to make his point. Alright, in constructing this, I've made it fairly drab for the simple reason I'm trying to avoid loaded words. About the most loaded word there is the deep shadows. which suggests something a little bit sinister going on. Of course, when you get to the dialogue, it's very clear something sinister is going on. But as far as narration goes, it's very bland, isn't it? There's no sense of personality here in the way the story's being told. It's going to rely entirely on the action and on the character. So we're trying to make the narrator disappear, not have a personality, not be present, so that the reader can just concentrate on the words and make their own decisions about things. Does that make sense? Let's look at the voiced narrator. What's the difference between an invisible narrator and voiced narrator? Oddly enough, we still would like the narrator to remain invisible so that the reader isn't disturbed, that the reader can allow themselves to be completely captured by what's happening in their heads. But nevertheless, invisible or not, this version gives the narrator a voice, a personality. Let's have a look at that same text, dressed up a little bit. The October night was hot and oppressive, the air thick enough to chew. Two men lurked in the deep shadows of a clump of palms near the Crown Plaza Hotel at Northcliffe, across from the light rail stop in the centre of the roadway. It was 12:30 a.m. The shorter man, Mike Bowman, kept his face turned towards the tree trunk, anxious not to be recognised. He was aware that he stank, the vinegary smell of stale sweat mixed with fear. His companion, Alec Smart, tall and thick-set, curled his lip in disdain. His machismo rarely faltered, although the common cold could reduce him, as it did all men, to a snivelling baby. Alec studied the approaching tram. "Come on, don't be a wuss. All you have to do is point him out. I'll do the rest." He nudged Bowman in the ribs with the pistol to make his point. Well, if you have a look at the two texts side by side there, you'll see that we've almost, I would imagine, we've doubled the word count. So where are the changes? Well, warm October night has become hot and oppressive, the air thick enough to chew. To describe something as oppressive means you're experiencing it. Who says the air is thick enough to chew? It's the narrator. The narrator is making these calls. The narrator is now adding a nuance. The two men no longer just stand in the deep shadows, they lurk. Can you see how this is more colourful language? There are implications with these words that weren't in the absolutely invisible narration. When we get to talk about Mike Bowman, he keeps his face turned towards the tree trunks, but now we learn he's anxious not to be recognised. So this is some additional information that the narrator knows, and now we get something from Mike himself. He was aware that he stank, and so now we get a picture or a smell of how he came to stink, a mixture of sweat and fear. And there's just a hint here, we might feel sorry for Mike. I mean, we normally feel something for people who are scared, even if they stink. Alex Smart, we don't feel sorry for. Someone who's full of disdain for someone else usually doesn't win our respect. He curled his lip in disdain. And here you notice the personality of the narrator. Note narrator, not author. The personality of the narrator comes out. There's a little hint of poking fun. We hear that his machismo rarely faltered, but that the common cold could reduce him to a snivelling baby. So it's a little bit of humour here. And the rest is much as it was in the first one. So you can see how the voiced narrator, while that entity does not stop the reader from engaging with the text at all, perhaps even helps the reader engage in the text, but certainly is manipulating the reader to believe certain things. For one thing, not to like Alex Smart very much. Alright, did you notice that this time the narrator, the unnamed narrator, has opinions? Can suggest things like the air was thick enough to chew. Someone has to make that assessment. The narrator has opinions. The narrator makes a statement about all men and the common cold. Did I personally make that statement? No, I did not. I think that's a slander against men. I mean, I get a cold as long as I can stay in bed 2 or 3 days. My wife brings me breakfast in bed before she goes off to work, maybe a couple of cups of coffee or something. It's easy, fine, no problem at all. So it's a slander against men to suggest that they fall to bits when they get the common cold. But I allow my narrating voice to make those terrible insinuations against the male species. So watch for that you can be gently led to like a character, to dislike a character by the narrating voice. That's one of the roles of the narrator. So that's that gentle voice that we hear as a narrator. Now let's make that voice a little bit stronger and make the narrating voice an actual minor character in the story. One of the most famous examples of this is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series. I'm sure you've read them. If you haven't read them, you've probably seen the movies. And Conan Doyle himself does not tell you the story of Sherlock Holmes. He has Sherlock's sidekick, Dr. Watson, who's quite sycophantic. He absolutely adores Sherlock. And so he's often the dummy who doesn't understand things. And of course, Sherlock has to explain his wonderful deductions to him. So Watson can go along on these various cases and be told all about them and observe things and observe Sherlock at work. And so we have this relatively minor character in the story who is doing the narrating. So here's just a couple of examples of that. You'll notice it's always told using the first person, I. Here's a couple of examples of that. Well, we've looked at the impersonal narrator, the silent narrator or the invisible narrator. Let's have a look at the narrator who's actually a character. And I mentioned the Sherlock Holmes series. This is taken from the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, and I obtained this from Project Gutenberg. During my long and intimate acquaintance with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I had never heard him refer to his relations, and hardly ever to his own early life. This reticence upon his part had increased the somewhat inhuman effect which he produced upon me, until sometimes I found myself regarding him as an isolated phenomenon, a brain without a heart, as deficient in human sympathy as he was preeminent in intelligence. His aversion to women and his disinclination to form new friendships were both typical of his unemotional character, but not more so than his complete suppression of every reference to his own people. I had come to believe that he was an orphan with no relatives living, but one day, to my very great surprise, he began to talk to me about his brother. Well, you can see why we talk about a narrative voice, because not only is someone telling a story, we're getting a sense of who this person is. In this case, it's a named person, Dr. Watson, and we come to know Watson almost as well as we know Sherlock Holmes. But it's a very interesting thing in that we can have an unnamed narrator who tells the story from beginning to end, and we may never know how he knows the characters or whether he's related to one of them. We don't know a thing about him, but it's a very strong voice. And so I've taken that story about Mike Bowman and Alex Smart, the story that I created, and I've provided now a different narrator. I knew it in my gut that Mikey Bowman was going to cop some trouble. He was always that kind of bloke. You can't hang around with types like that loudmouth Alex Smart without some trouble or other rubbing off on you. Mike thought he'd curry favour with him by telling him some guy was screwing his wife. Never occurred to the silly twit that Smart would want to do something about it, like kill the bloke. So you see what I mean? We have a very pronounced voice here. a personality emerging, someone that uses slang, which the impersonal narrator would never do. If you're trying to remain invisible, you certainly don't use slang or swear, whereas a character narrator is quite legitimately able to do all of those things. So here is someone telling a story. He seems to know Mikey Bowman intimately, as though he'd been to school with him, but we don't know who he is. So keep those two forms in mind, where someone is a character in the story and interacts with the other characters, as Watson does with Holmes, or it can be like this one, who can tell you all about them, but you never find out that he says anything to any of these people, or has a meal with them, or anything like that. So I'm calling him the unnamed character narrator. First person narration. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. It's the one that probably comes easiest to us. It's the one that pops into our head most likely when we go to write a story, for the simple reason it's the way we tell a story about ourselves. If we're talking to friends over coffee, or if you're at the pub talking to a mate and you say, oh, I went here and I did this and I did that, and I don't like this and I don't like that. It's very easy because you're familiar with talking about yourself. So when you adopt a persona, you might be 19th century gypsy, but you're still saying, I did this, I did that, whatever. So that's a very simple narrating voice to use. What's good about it? Well, because we're so familiar with it, listening to it from friends, when someone starts writing in first person, it makes us feel as though we're being spoken to by a friend. So it feels very authentic. It's very believable. There's a sense of immediacy, as though we're sitting there hearing all about it right now. So if we're looking to establish that rapport with the reader, get them on side, get them to like the character, using first person is excellent for that. So if it's so good, why don't we use it all the time? Well, it has its downside. Often we want to show what's happening elsewhere, outside the character's life. Now, if there's a killer in another city about to fly to wherever our central character is and assassinate them, when you're writing in first person, the character can't possibly know about this. The only way your character can know about it, and hence reveal it to the reader, is to get a phone call from a friend and say, hey, I just saw the killer get on a plane and he's coming to get you. Right? So you need all sorts of other devices, because you cannot tell your reader anything that the central character, your protagonist, doesn't know him or herself. So your character has blinkers on. You can't suddenly step outside the character and report what's happening elsewhere. You can't step outside the character and report the thoughts of the person they're arguing with. You can only do it by saying, I bet he's thinking this, or I wonder if, right? You cannot know what the other person is thinking. So these are quite severe limitations on storytelling if you're using first person. The other thing is, we all like to describe our characters. If it's the person speaking, it's quite inappropriate for them to describe themselves. Here I am, I have grey hair, I wear glasses and hearing aids. No, doesn't work. And please don't fall back on the old one of having them look in a mirror and describe what they see. It is dead and buried. Don't do it. Okay. So there's the positives for first person: immediacy, a greater sense of empathy from the reader, very natural writing style. And the negative, you only can reveal to your reader exactly what your character knows. Now, I've deliberately left out one mode, and that is second person. The reason I've left it out is because if you're a novice writer, I believe, keep away from it. It's too difficult. Second person narrator is when you say, you walked into the room and you saw me standing there and you did this and you did that. It's too hard to sustain for 300 or 400 pages. A few writers have attempted it. Some have gotten away with it, but believe me, it becomes rather wearing. Supposedly, it makes us feel more involved. I've never felt that. I've just felt rather irritated by it. Seek out your own examples of that. I'm not even going to go there. What do I recommend? Well, first person is great. Third person limited can be even more useful than first person because you can show what's happening outside the character's head as well as inside it. And third person multiple can be useful too. Well, I'm going to interrupt myself here. It was my intention to deal with all the types of narrative voices in this one lesson, but it's gone on a great deal of time, and I think you need a break. I think you need time to assimilate what we've talked about already. And so next week I'm going to do third person. That will be third person omniscient, third person limited, third person multiple. Something to look forward to next week, and I'll be showing you also how to use third person to eliminate a lot of the showing that we do and make sure that we're telling. So that's all next week, the big issues. What do you do this week? What's your exercise? Okay, if you've written a first chapter or some more, identify what you've written it in. That's not too hard. Is it first person? Is it third person? If it's third person, take your central character and try writing it in first person, so you're writing as that character, and see what emerges from that. If you automatically chose first person, write it again in third person. You can still show what they're thinking and feeling by using a strong point of view, POV, but see if you can't use some other aspects of third person to broaden the story outside the limitations of first person. So in other words, take what you've got and reverse it and see if it gives you greater insights into your characters perhaps, or gives you greater flexibility in what you're writing about. So I'll close yet again with my email address, because if you'd like some other exercises to do in first person and third person, I can send you those if you send me your email. And I'll also be able to put you on the mailing list to be alerted when each of these lessons come up on YouTube. So here's my email address. And until next week, it's bye-bye and keep safe.